Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings. How's everybody doing? I hope everybody's doing copacetic, doing all right. To Brother Ogawa and Wolf Manlu, the first to check in. Loud to Zoo, right up there. Gloria Briscoe, Dinah Battles. Greetings to all of you and to others that will be coming in for this show. I just want to remind people to hit the like button, and for the people who are checked in, you've already subscribed, but throughout the show, I'm going to be encouraging if there's any new viewers to subscribe, and if they can, make a donation. Sister Peggy Parks Miller, greetings to you. So this will be part 3 of a series on ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. This one will kind of segue into the first dynasty of Kemet, or the first dynasties. So this is an extension of that. For people who are new to the show, these shows are like chapters in a book, and many of these chapters are going to be turned into books. And so there's a logical order to what we've covered in the ancient Kemetic series, or the ancient Egyptian series. Last week, people were privileged to have on this show Dr. Brandley Faulkner, who teaches Virginia Tech in the former Confederate state of Virginia, a state that she was born in. And she's in her early 40s, I think it's 42. And she's a serious community organizer as well as a scholar. and she's a professor there as well. But her main focus is on organizing, and she had some very important insights to share with people on her experiences and her views of the younger generation that fuel the organizing in our community. She made the point that most of the organizers are between 17 and 30, very few in the 40s and above. Because when I had referred to when we first started talking, because Brother Ugawa was the one that made this hookup, all praise to Brother Ugawa. I was referring to her as you know, not as an elder. And she said, I'm an elder, 42. But after listening to her discussion of her interaction with the people she's organizing with, she is an elder in relationship to them. And she's definitely drawn on a lot of wisdom that has come from previous organizing experiences, but shaped a lot of approaches of her own. So her insights were very, very valuable. Brother Ugawa was noting that I was lit up the whole time. Well, we have so much in common. It's funny. Both scholars and organizers, and both of us placed a greater emphasis on the organizing than on the scholarship because that's where change is produced. And in my case, personal change, awakening, and that's also what transformed me into scholarship. Um, but once she started talking about her interaction with the younger generation, then I could get her point. To them, she's an elder. She had some important insights. The most important one for me that caused me to do a lot of thinking is that she was critiquing this group-centered leadership because based on how the youth are responding to breakdowns in the Black community, police violence, the prison industrial complex, and a host of other issues, because of breakdown of community institutions and also a gap between generations, the youth, Black youth, have found themselves in a position where they see themselves collectively as leaders and are suspicious of individual leadership. So she had a critique on that. And what I liked was she didn't just fall in because she's organized in that group and is closer to that age group than we are, just a buy-in. She had a critique. And that critique was interesting. And she's critiquing whether or not what she calls flat organizations, which means organization with no leadership and very often little structure, though it has leadership, it's very collective, whether that was sufficient. And she was really raising questions about certain things that a community needed to address that would require you to go beyond that. And so it really caused me to think, and I hope it caused some of you to think. And she and I are going to be working on a number of projects. And Woof Manlu says she has your fire. Yeah, she's got a passion, boy. You hear me? Another thing we found out we had in common, because she has worked out a particular way in her hiring process and stuff, but her drive and even going to university and eventually getting a PhD is around organizing. So I was wondering, so what did you get in the university that could orient you in that direction? So she asked me, what did I major in as an undergraduate? I majored in, well, I told her administration. And so she said, business or government? And I said, business. And she said, no, I said government. And she said, that's the same thing I majored in, all the way through the PhD. I said, oh, really? That's smart because administration's about the closest thing you're going to get to organizing in a university curriculum. And then she could stretch it to come up with the way in which she wanted to study some stuff. So quite brilliant. I said, whoa. So she literally puts her full time into organizing. And there are a lot of younger people out there doing that. A larger percentage of them are sisters, and the groups she works with are predominantly female because of the nature of the breakdown in the Black community, where sisters have really been filling the gap in the community, and that includes leadership gaps. So y'all should be proud to be able to know that you've got young people out there doing this. Trump would still be in office if you didn't. And, they're taking things higher and higher, and they're into nitty gritty organizing, real rough, tough stuff that they're dealing with, so I really enjoyed her, and she's going to be on many times in the future. I want to remind people that next week's show will be on Malcolm X, and I misnamed the name of the book that we're going to be covering, which is a book entitled The Dead Are Arising. And it's a Pulitzer Prize winning book. This book is so good that I think that it's the replacement for the autobiography, because the autobiography went off of Malcolm's memory. And then there's a lot that he said that's not in the autobiography. But basically, it was his memory. And so if you're really looking at that, he was one of the younger children in his family. And so when he's going back to giving an account of certain things that happened early in his life, that's not based on the clearest of memories, because he was very young. And then, of course, he was going on what other people told him. So the real good thing, and the author of this book is Les Payne. Payne's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and a Pulitzer Prize winning author that he won for this book on Malcolm. Payne went and interviewed over 400 people over a period of 25 years. And Dr. Raymond Wimbush and I, who will be discussing this next week, he was asked by the publisher to fact check the book, and which he did. And he found only one error. Only one. So if you haven't read this book, you should get it. It is well worth the reading. The Dead Are Arising. The Dead Are Arising. Okay, let's get into today's show. I don't know if you noticed, but I'm dealing with stuff ain't nobody else covering, and particularly ancient Kemet. I suppose if you had at least one other scholar that's out there, Dr. Finch, talking about this, he would probably focus on that. He's got a book coming out on that, and you should check it out. But most of our scholars start with the beginning of the first dynasty. So the topic for today's discussion is the hieroglyphic or Medu Netcher divine mentality of Kemetic, African, and African American civilizations. And believe it or not, African Americans have a civilization, highly evolved, by the way, meets the standards of civilization, both as a complexity, consisting of many complex components, stratified, in the case of a largely urban, though originally rural population, rich in the arts, rich in the sciences, including astrophysics, mathematics, rich in every domain, with the most complex culture in this country, and one of the most complex in the world. And contrary to what Blacks often say, that they dehumanized us in slavery, there's a difference between being exposed to dehumanized conditions and being dehumanized. The dehumanized ones were the ones that enslaved us, not us. And the proof of the pie is in the pudding. We came out of enslavement with our humanity intact and without hardly 2 nickels to rub together. We took care of each other, and whatever we've achieved has been on our own effort. And though we came out with our humanity intact, because enslavement was rough, it meant that we had to be tougher. And so we also came out with tough edges, and we came out with scars, and we came out with a lot of issues. But one of the things that characterized this culture more than anything was kindness. And it's that kindness which is at the core of African and African American culture, which grows out of humanism, a central part of African American, African Caribbean, South American, African diasporan culture. Humanism, you know? And I see a lot of people, I look at the Facebook comments and stuff, and some of these are not people who are engaged in a battle. A few are, but most of them are not. And so they've reached the conclusion that for us to go forward, we've got to be as mean-spirited as they are, as vicious as they are. That's not true. Muhammad Ali was the best heavyweight champion, perhaps ever, definitely of his time, and he could knock you out. But his greatness was in his character. That's what Mike Tyson's trainer told him. His greatness was in his character. And if you become just like the people you're oppressed, then you will remain oppressed. You hear me? So holding on to your dignity and humanity is key, and that hasn't been a problem for us. And so we're going to be looking at the hieroglyphic or Medu Netcher divine mentality of Kemetic African and African American civilization. And why am I lumping them all together? Because we share common cultural unity. And this feature of the hieroglyphic or Medu Netcher thought pattern is central to it, as well as are many other features of this culture. So this is then going to be looking at the role of hieroglyphic or Medu Netcher thought in building Kemetic and African American civilization. There are many elements to building a civilization, but your thought pattern or your philosophy is key. And this is at the heart of both of those. So Medu Netcher or hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics I'll get into a minute to distinguish those two terms, but I use it because it's more popularly known. That characteristic is special to African people and how we think and how we view things. And the study of it is often neglected, particularly in the African American context. Wolf Manlu, in responding to my comment of don't become like them, he said, I think we have to do is not have anything at all to do with them, let them become extinct. I think the best thing that the average Aryan could do, or European, is just leave the world alone. That would be nice. That ain't going to happen. But that would be nice. The world would be a better place. You know what I mean? So these subjects are being linked because we're all African people and we share in certain common cultural unities. And this one on Medu Netcher or hieroglyphics, and Medu Netcher would be the term for the speech of Kemet, the writing of Kemet. You could talk about the Yoruba language or the Dogon language or any of a number of others, and you'd be referring to the same thing, just a different linguistic name, but the way they work would work very much the same. And so this is also important because when we really understand the mindset that's central to our people, we'll have a better understanding of what we're drawing from as we're rebuilding societies in Africa and the Caribbean and in this country. So we'll draw from the deep well, and instead of trying to conform to the European or Aryan standard, we'll be looking at our own. You know. Now, I want to do a little review because in order for you to get this one, some of you didn't watch the previous shows, but those that you have, I know that some of the memory may have faded. So to connect the emphasis on the hieroglyphics or Medu Netcher to the building of civilization, it's important to note the context that this discussion has developed out of. And so there's been 2 previous shows on ancient Kemet, or Europeans call it Egypt. The correct term is Kemet, which means black-skinned person, KMT. And in Medu Netcher, it's actually a picture of charcoal and a picture of a black-skinned person. Not dark, not as Mary Lefkowitz said, dark complexion people. There's only one word, as Dr. Obenga points out, in the Kemetic language for black, and it's KMT. And since we don't know how the Kemites spoke, we know how they wrote, so vowels are put in so you can pronounce it. So Kemet, Kemet, but it meant black-skinned people. You hear me? That's who they're talking about. And so this is an extension of this previous discussion. Now, so in the first show, was dealing with why ancient Kemet, why going back 10,000 BC, which is the period of time that the Kemetic priest, people like Sheikh Anta Diop, and many others trace to be the time of origin for Kemetic civilization, 10,000 BC. So the point that I was stressing in that first show was that when you start with 31, 32, or 3300 BC, you're number one, you're buying into a European time frame. That is, the Europeans would like to stick Kemet in, say, the 3100 BC, at best 3200, because they want to give Samaria or Mesopotamia the 100-year lead. And so that's really the setup. When that puts you at a real disadvantage. First of all, they've given them a time period of 3300 BC using Sumerian script that are clay tablets. That means that they didn't persist. So they don't have the evidence to back that up, where you've got stone monuments and you have all kinds of writings and stuff that go back to ancient periods in Kemet. So that's a disadvantage. But the main reason that I put the focus on ancient Kemet, which I've which the Europeans call pre-dynastic Kemet, and I've renamed, is because if you leave that out, then you are ignoring the formation of Kemetic civilization. And therefore, you don't know how it originated and what it contributed. And without that, it's kind of like walking into a building and going to the top floor, or building a building and not putting the emphasis on its foundation. You know what's going to happen with any building like that. And so most of our historians don't study this period. And I don't just do it because they don't, but I'm into roots. I want to go back to the beginning. So when we're looking at 10,000 BC as the marker for the beginning of Kemetic civilization, and I started with 9,500 BC, when you use a framework that is workable, then that framework can get you to an ancient period. So in the first discussions on this series, I went into using the precession of the equinoxes. And as people that have seen this before, this is the Temple of Dendera in Kemet, in which in one of the places you find the zodiac, which is what you have here on the ceiling. And this was also the basis for tracing the precession of the equinoxes, which is this wobble of the earth in relationship to the zodiac. One complete wobble takes 26,000 years. And so it then changes the historical climate based on which of these zodiacal signs the earth is aimed at. So, and today we're going to look at the cycle of the bull, which in Western astronomy is Taurus. And we're going to look at what that meant for what's hitting this earth at that time. So I was using an unorthodox method. It's only unorthodox because if you're trained in the Western method, you're trained just in a factual system, and facts are important, but you discard anything else. Yet the skies are important, and astronomy is important, and everything out there has its own environment. And so the astrological environment is key, and precession of the equinoxes is central. And so for today, we're going to be looking at the precessional equinox cycle of Taurus, which, by the way, that was Malcolm's sun sign. In the first show, I looked at the Sphinx and pointed out that the Sphinx was an indication of how the people in this ancient period, starting 10,000 BC, and I started with 9,500, how they were influenced by the heavenly environment or the astronomical environment, because they were in the precessional cycle of Leo, which is the lion. And we see here this great Sphinx, which is considered to be at least 10,000 years old, to be a lion, the body of a lion with the head of a person, and Dr. Finch says of a female. And I have no problem with that. If he can prove that, that would be consistent with the Anu or Chwa origin of Kemet, which was twin lineal, male-female balanced, and in the agrarian period when they transitioned from hunter-gatherer to agricultural, they were peaceful societies inclining towards the female, because women, having some very strong spiritual powers, were able to pipe into some things that men sometimes don't pipe into. So this was just part of the discussion of that particular period. So in the first historical period, that was stressed. And then in its second, I went through the processional cycle of Shu-Tefnut that corresponds in Western astronomy and astrology to Gemini. And this cycle began around 5800 BC. And the more research I do, I think it confirms that this is the period in which Asar emerges as the first pharaoh of Kemet, sometime in this period, because of the way in which the civilization worked at that time and the way in which Asar is associated with Shu and Tefnut. And it would take a number of thousand years before civilization that begins 10,000 BC could evolve to a pharaonic model. And this pharaonic model draws heavily from African civilizations in general. This may be the oldest of the structured societies that, have a national government and a national head. But this idea of pharaoh goes back to the hunter-gatherer period, where they did not have leaders, but where spirit was central and the concept of God was central to that as a force, as an energy, not as a human being. But as Africans move to the agrarian stage, then what you see is they become to do something a little bit more stratified. One of the things they have over time as they become larger are lineages. And then as they become even larger, clans. And so the lineage head becomes the person, an elder, and there are a lot of different criteria. Generally, the best elder, the wisest and kindness, and the one most considerate of the people's needs, and so forth. But the primary role of the elder in serving as what they would call the first among equals was to maintain a connection with the spirit world. And that is basically Pharaoh's central job, is to maintain contact with God, which Pharaoh is God, but the greater God. And we'll go into that in a minute. But the point is that was the central point. So the root of pharaonic civilization is, again, not just Kemetic, it's an African root, which Kemet is a part of. But often we talk of it in isolation from the rest of Africa. And so this period of twinness that I discussed before, when the processional cycle is emphasizing twinness, not opposites, that is, entities that are identical. So in Dogon thought, twins are never referred to in the plural. They're always referred to in the singular, because they represent first unity. And then they represent the fact that you can't have one without the other, interdependence. And so in Kemet, it's interesting that at the processional cycle of twinness, what you're seeing are twin themes all over Kemet. And so you see Asar, which I'll put up later, is wearing two crowns. One is the white crown of the south, which is Upper Kemet. The south in Kemet is upper. And then the ram's crown, which is only worn by pre-dynastic pharaohs, starting with the Sar. The two crowns symbolize that he is pharaoh of a united Kemet. And so we find that in this ancient period, where the pharaoh is wearing both the crown of Upper and Lower Kemet, you find that in a unified kingdom, the pharaoh is ruling a society in which twinness is expressed. And this is real key. And so what we see during this twin period is twin cities. What we're seeing is twin crowns. We're seeing twin capitals. And so all of this is central to the to what was going on during this Shu Tefnut period. So also, I was stressing in the ancient period of Kemet, when you looked at the carvings, one of the central carvings that you find in ancient Kemet is the carving which you see on the upper right-hand corner, 4 of them, of the Black Venus. And the Black Venus is very important. Now, when Petrie, who's supposed to be the authority on this, covers this, he leaves this completely out, what it means, because then he's not able to claim this as something other than black, because he tried to treat the ancient period of Kemetic civilization as not black. And so the Venus figure is the heavy-set woman with the big behind, and you see that in the center picture, and then you also see it on the one to the end, and then you see it in the profile. Well, this is symbolic of the San, S-A-N woman, or Kun woman. And these are the world's first people, according to mitochondrial DNA. And it's the Anu who are descended from them. And what this is telling you is that in this ancient period, the woman played a central role. And she was a priestess. She was also probably a goddess figure. And if that Great Sphinx is also in the image of a woman, that's just further proof of it. And this is a common object that is found in the pre-dynastic finds. Here, you see this object on the left in the center. Again, the same kind of Venus woman, and in this particular case with scarifications or country marks, again, an African mark of initiation, indicating that she was a highly evolved spirit person. All of this was spirit. And then you'll notice the natural combs. Only civilization, well, black folks would have a natural comb. You ain't going to find one natural comb in ancient Europe unless there's some blacks there, you know. So this is also showing you the nature of the civilization. It was spirit-based. The other thing that I did in looking at the ancient period is I reject the notion of pre-dynastic, because it's clear that Asar is the pharaoh of the first dynasty in ancient Kemet, somewhere around 5800 BC, not 3300. And he wore both crowns, had a unified kingdom, which was peaceful. And so if this is the first dynasty, then how can it be called the pre-dynastic, before dynasties. How can it be called that? And so I've renamed this, not arbitrarily, not coming with a name that I invented, but what the people called themselves. I call this ancient period the historical period of the great ones. The great ones, you know? And I think that might be an understatement, given that they innovated the highest level of classical civilization, urban civilization. The Twa were the most widespread civilization in the world, innovated some of the most complex elements of civilization, that is medicine, astrophysics, physics. Their very conception of God is based on physics. We'll go back through that in a minute. But in the case of classical civilization, none come close to Kemet. And so, since all the elements of classical civilization of Kemet happen to be innovated in this ancient period, then I think it's only correct to name that period in the name of the founders. And that's the golden age of the great ones. You hear me? I bet you they wouldn't disagree with that, you know? So today, what I want to do is a transition in the processional cycle from Shu and Tefnut to what is in the West called Taurus, which in Kemet was the processional cycle of the bull, which is what Taurus is, the bull. And what happens when the Earth's plane to the zodiac shifts, its relationship to the zodiacal band shifts, there's a 2,100 year period of 12 subcycles. It's uneven, but it comes close to 26,000 years. So when we go from 5,800 BC to the following period, that 2100 cycle would leave you at about 3,700 BC, which doesn't mean that the first dynasty of Kemet was founded in 3700 BC, though it could be. But it means that it was founded during this period. And what happens with astronomy, astrology is, so the climate, that is the astronomical, historical climate on Earth, changes. And with that, then certain things tend to change in what's happening on Earth. It doesn't mean people are going up and copying this and just doing this, but it means that it's an environment. And you'll find that as these civilizations are being built, you're finding it all over the world, at least in certain high places, some later. But this is the nature of it. So what would the processional cycle of Taurus tend to mean for what's going on in Kemet at that time? Well, the first thing is the processional cycle of Taurus, in which Menes, M-E-N-E-S, or Aha, A-H-A-M-E-N-A, was the first pharaoh. It would mean that that pharaoh and subsequent pharaohs are then going to be responding to this kind of astro-historical climate. Just as right now we're seeing a transition from the Piscean to the age of Aquarius, and we've seen the opening chapters I pointed out before of revolution that occurred in the beginning of the 20th century especially, and which proves to be a very revolutionary period as things break down. The climate breaks down, people break down, living under great poverty, and a host of other things, the conditions are building up for some real serious transformations. So, what were the characteristics of what would be called the age of the bull or the Taurian age? The main characteristic of this age, just as the one with Shu Tefnut would be twinness, the main characteristic of this age would be building, building. Doesn't necessarily mean buildings, it can, but it is a period of great building of various different things. And it would be a period that is consistent, which is the nature of this Taurian period. They tend to consistently build on certain themes. And you'll usually find that people who come up under these signs have those characteristics, some greater than others, though they're not just restricted to this sign. So building can mean the building of engineering structures. The first pharaoh, Menes, Aha-Mena, was a hydraulic engineer. And so his engineering dealt with water, which made sense since this is a country that is fed by the Nile. So this period is one where Aha-Mena is able to raise up land so that he can create a new city, which is Memphis. Hydraulic engineer, a builder. Hieroglyphic asks, how is it some are born with good character and others are not? Astronomy, astrology doesn't deal with your culture. It doesn't deal with your level of spiritual growth and development. You know what I mean? You come here with certain qualities from the other realm, and then you make choices on this realm. So what it deals with are the basic characteristics in the case of history of a time period, in the case of a person of certain qualities, certain gifts, and certain weaknesses. That's what that deals with. What you do with that, it's your choice. That's why you're here. This is not a predetermined thing, you know. So in any sign, you can have highly evolved, lowly evolved, ain't got nothing to do with astrology. It's got to do with your spirit. And you can have two people from two different cultures born at the same time. It's going to be different, particularly in culture, because they're going to come from different cultures. So you don't use this for that. You know, that ain't what it works for. So good question, Hieroglyphic. And everything in here is finally to be or not to be. You can be yourself or not be. That's your choice. Uh-oh, we've got Hoppy family in the house. Felicia, hello. Peace to you. And I hope that the Hoppy conference went well, because I know they worked their butts off for it, you know, and they deserve it. And y'all need to be watching Hoppy. Good show. And two good people, you know. So so this period then of the bull is characteristic of what becomes what the Kemites call the dynastic period, but I would just call it this 3200 on period, because the dynastic occurred at least 5800 BC. So one structure then that they built was the hydraulic structure, that is having more influence over the Nile. But it's interesting, they were opposed to dams. They considered dams, D-A-M-S, as a violation of Ma'at. And if you look at what the Aswan Dam did to Kemet, you get an idea of why. or what you see is dams doing all over the world. On the one hand, they have the positive hydroelectric power, which you didn't need then, and a whole lot of other things in terms of regulating the flow of water. But what they do is disrupt nature. And I know in the case of Kemet, what's happened with the Aswan Dam project under Nasser was, of course, you buried whole areas in Nubia and whatnot, historical sites and stuff. But you also changed how flooding worked. And so instead of the flooding coming through the alluvial natural rise and fall of the Nile, which means black soil that's rich, you just have to stick a seed in the ground and it's going to grow. Now they had a plague of rats. You understand? So, and then, there's a whole thing of building dams to determine who gets what and who doesn't get what. And that's some issues that Egypt and the Sudan are having, over who's going to get all of this. So, so one of the things about this period is it's a building period, and in this particular case, it's oriented towards the water. And so it's no accident that your first pharaoh is a hydraulic engineer. But as again, under the bull would indicate that as this is a building period, this can be the building of structures. In this case, organizational structures, such as government structures. That is, the leadership structure of Kemet, Pharaoh, the priestly structure. Now, these structures had been built prior to that in the period of the Great Ones, but it's going to take on a particular shape under particular kind of spirit influences during this period. So this would be a period of that. And one thing you have to say, this is definitely a consistent building period of structures, because the governmental apparatus, which had been set up in the period of the Great Ones, the ancient period, is certainly extended over a long period of time, from the first to the beginning of the fifth dynasty. And so during that particular time, you have these organizational structures, the priesthood, the pharaohship, and then, of course, the organization of the family, which is twinlineal, which is based on a male-female interaction. Most scholars will say, as Obinga says, this was a society based on equality, specifically twinlineal. And in the case of Kemet, the wife's eldest brother was in charge, and in the case of the pharaoh, she was married to her brother. But among the Kemites at large, this was a system in which descent was traced through the line of the woman, but there was a male-female balance going on. Interestingly enough, in Kemet, because a lot is not done to look at the lives of everyday people, the women were the farmers in Kemet, and that was an agrarian economy. And that comes out of the hunter-gatherer thing where they discover agriculture. The men were in charge of weaving, which they did in the home. Interestingly enough, in Kemet, when they carried stuff, the woman carried stuff, the man carried it on his head. The men also tended cattle, and where it was necessary, were part of the army. Most of Kemet's history, they didn't have a standing army. They didn't need one. And that's the key point I made about the period of the Great Ones. There's hardly any weapons during this period because it was a peaceful period. And that was a period in which you could innovate civilization. And by the way, I think the greatest innovations in civilization in ancient Kemet were made before the Pharaonic period. Why? Well, because if that Pharaonic system emerges around 5800 BC, you have a number of thousand years preceding that where the society was run without pharaohs, and how would it be run the way the hunter-gatherers ran things when they transitioned to agriculture? It would be based on a male-female balance. And those carvings that you saw, the black Venuses, is just one indication of that. And, men and women would both agree to a balanced society, but inclining towards the female. You understand? And her being the agriculturalist, she was the one that really guaranteed that you ate. The men hunted, but you don't always capture game, but you're going to generally grow food. So out of the old structure comes the extension of it into the period of Hapi, the bull. And of course, this is a period where you have the Per Ankh institution created, House of Life educational institution, which I've adapted into a Per Ankh House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership Institute. We're adapting that to the 21st century to train leaders and organizers. And Sister Brandy is going to be helping me with that and others. She already has an assignment. She's been asked to do something that I couldn't do. So she's going to figure out some stuff. We're going to have us an intergenerational collaboration here. You know what I mean? So organization is a key feature of this building structure. And of course, when it was necessary, military structures, because that's going to happen at a certain point, particularly when they have to throw the Hyksos out. That's going to happen. But any society that relies too heavily on the military is going to have problems. But when you're invaded, you're going to have to be able to defend yourself. And by the way, the peaceful societies of Africa were not naive. They had measures for defense. They were usually citizens' militias. Obenga and I, when we were talking about ancient African history, we both agreed that this isn't just true of Kemet. Most of ancient Africa, the civilizations existed without standing militaries. But they had citizens' militias, that is, people who were ready to defend their country. And they had the baddest warrior tradition on the planet. So if you think peaceful meant passive, you got another story coming. You hear me? That's why the samurai say, to be a great samurai, you need a little bit of black blood. What happens if you got a lot? And I pointed this out before, the code of the African warrior, and there's a kingdom called the Segu Kingdom, which is a Bambara kingdom, Segu. The code of a warrior was fearlessness. It wasn't masking fear. Most warrior codes mask fear. That's the baddest warrior, the one that ain't got no fear. Because I'm going to tell you, when you're outside the zone of fear, you make fewer mistakes. I know, because I'm in that zone. I was in a partial fear zone when I had the fear of the consequences of my own wrongdoing, which is my inheritance of the Judeo-Christian Islamic thing, but it comes from the Kemetic thing. The idea that if I did something real wrong, I'd go to hell. I never had a great fear of that because I didn't do anything really wrong. But I reached a point, I've said this before for some people, I reached a point where I realized that this is ridiculous. If I do something that bad, what's fear got to do with it? I'm going to have to face it anyway. You know what I mean? So fearlessness, that's a quality of nobility. It's a quality of nobility. And that's the quality that our people have, a whole lot of them. So what we see then is that this is then a period of building. Well, of course, we know that the greatest architectural structures in the world, other than the Sphinx, they were built during this period, particularly the 3rd and 4th dynasties. of Kemet. And those were the Great Pyramids that were located along the path of most of them, the star Orion, which is, by the way, the name for Osiris. And Orion is the beginning of our stellar system in the Milky Way neighborhood. So these were astronomical observatories and many other things, but they're among the greatest wonders of the world. The first one being the Step Pyramid of Imhotep, the multi-genius father of medicine, prime minister of Kemet, and a chief architect, among other things, And that was the Step Pyramid, which had been a mastaba, one slab, where people of royal birth had been buried before, or some of the higher priests. And what he did is stack one mastaba on top of the other, each one being shorter. And so you get what's called the Step Pyramid. And that was really the first pyramid for Kemet. And it would be revisited again in the 25th dynasty when the Ethiopians came to power under Pianki, and where his sister ruled Kemet, Kentucky. Brother here, Wolf Manlou, is talking about hasn't the CIA and FBI declassified the UFO files? Well, whether they have or not, they didn't have anything to do with what we created. I'll tell you that. There were no aliens involved in this creation. In fact, the problem would be is when the aliens came, and that would be in the period after the 11th dynasty. And those aliens would come from Earth. They'd be called Hyksos. This is the nature of this particular period. It's a building period. And in its ability to build a civilization that's lasting, hey, Felicia, to build a lasting civilization, then it was necessary that the people in this 3300 BC on period refine this notion of pharaoh, draw on it, which is coming from Asar, but refine it as well. And this is, of course, Asar, who is your first pharaoh. As I noted before, Asar was called the Black One. You can see that's him. And this is an actual rendition of Asar. And I gave proof in a previous show that he is, or was, that was him. And he was a real person. He was also, his title was the Pure One, and I pointed out before, that's the same title that the Kun people or San people had for themselves, except during this period in which Asar is first pharaoh, and you notice he's wearing the white crown in the center and the ram's crown on the side. Asar is the Pure One, but among his ancestors, all of them were. So that's telling you that while this is a great period, it's telling you that not everyone there was at this pure state. Asar was an example of one who was. And in fact, he would play the role of taking some pretty wild behaving people in Kemet, taller Africans, because these Asar are little people that illustrated in my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, caused by a choice between two cultures. That's a great one gone to worship the pharaoh. That's in the ancient period. He's one of those, So the perfection of the pharaonic system is one of the things. Now, this is something I really want to clarify because I've made this comment since my specialty is on ancient Kemet. I've always looked at this question of the role of Set in the dynastic system. Set is the brother of Asar. And according to the story is that Aset cut his brother into parts and he was put back together except for his sexual organ, symbolizing that he had a rebirth to a new life, a spiritual life. Yet, the problem with that was that in the ancient period of the Anu, of the great ones, it is Set who is the god Netcher, or Netcher for Pharaoh. Set. There's no way in the world that the Kemites would have a figure, a Netcher figure for Pharaoh who had destroyed their first Pharaoh, Asar. The manifestation of civilization. No way. So as I've done further research, what I've found is that the basis for this notion that Asar was cut to pieces by Set comes from Plutarch, Plutarch. That's his version. Most historians have taken up that version. But in reading some writings from my master, Dr. Jacob Carruthers, one of his works, Essays on Ancient Egyptian Studies, his research shows that the original story of Asar and what happened to him was that he drowned, but apparently didn't die. He was saved. He was drowning and was saved by implication. And afterwards, he and his wife, Aset, conceived of Heru. So this makes more sense. Now, the Shabaka stone, which is a recording of old writings of Kemet, put together in the 25th dynasty, but it's drawing on old thought, has pieces on this. It doesn't say it is true or false, but the general account that is used by many historians show that it was a drowning, not being cut up. This is important because then it means that the Anu, who are Set people, it means the Set has a different meaning. And it would appear that the meaning of Set in the context of a drowning is he represents the part of pharaohship that represents power. Whereas Horus represents legitimacy, the legitimacy of whoever holds the throne. And so these are not conflicting, and one isn't one that you would reject, but they are both compatible. So what we know is with the first dynasty and preceding it, the findings in Kutzel indicate that a figure in Nubia who's on a boat, who's Pharaoh, he has the crown of Pharaoh, has over his head or facing him the symbol of Horus. And yet this area, Nubia, was a part of the Anu period, or the historical period of the great ones. So this is telling you that somewhere in this period, there's a transition. And while the majority of the Anu people are still Set people, Scorpion being one, and he's the last one to be conquered, he is defeated, and that's when the Horus people come in. That would be Menes or Mena or Aha Mena. And so pharaohship in this period, 32, 33, 3100 BC, is under the influence of Horus. These two people are different in that while they're African, one is of the Anu, these small people, and the other is of the larger Africans who had been in Kemet for a while and had undergone civilization from the Anu, much the way I described it in a series I did on the ancestral powers of the Twa in civilizing the Bantu people, taller people who were just in many ways but wild, and they had to be tamed. And that's what Asar said he had to do, or the writings on him said he had to do in Kemet. And these would not be taming Asiatics. These would be taming some other Africans, and it wouldn't be Anu. They didn't have to be tamed. These are the pure ones. You don't tame pure ones, this then is key. So we have the development of the pharaonic system, and moving from Set to Heru or Horus. And so the notion of leadership then of Pharaoh is as number one, there is no state in Kemet. State in Europe means the instruments of violence, usually the army, the police, and all these things. Remember, we had no prisons or anything like that. So the notion of state was really foreign to Africa, Nation state, people with a common culture, nation. But then state, the instruments for control, keeping people under control. And anytime you have the state tied to the nation, you usually have inequality, because the people who control the violence through power are able to use this to grab the wealth. And that's why you end up with European and other states, because they're there first to protect the rulers from the people who want to even things out. That's the American system, That's why the Constitution was put in place, because, as Madison said, they did not want an equal distribution of wealth. He said if we didn't have a republic, he said the people would equalize the wealth and wouldn't pay their debts. And they wouldn't pay their debts in part because they're unfair. You buy a house and you pay an interest on it. If you pay it for 30 years, you doubled or tripled what you paid for the house. Now that's really usury. You know what I mean? But it's legalized because they can enforce it and bring the sheriff or the police to throw you out if you don't make your payments. Or if it's Wells Fargo, as they've done, taking people's houses even when they were up on their mortgage. They weren't behind. You hear me? Stealing it. You know what I mean? So that's the state. But in a state where there's a balance between males and females, or at least an attempt to respect both, particularly the female, then and in peaceful societies, you're not going to have that. Now, Asar was in this period, 3300 BC, the symbol of legitimacy for Pharaoh, and represented the legal authority, so to be. But Pharaoh was God on earth. And so instead of having a state, you had Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh was a mediator between heaven and earth. And the thing that guided Pharaoh was Ma'at. To be a good Pharaoh, you should be in harmony with harmony, truth, justice, balance, right order. Not all pharaohs were. But if you wanted good government, then it had to be based on that. And so the role of Pharaoh was to check disorder, isfet, I-S-F-E-T, isfet, disorder. That was his role. This was key. Now, Asar, according to the spiritual teachings of Kemet, was appointed to his office by the Netcher Geb, G-E-B, which is the Netcher of earth. And what this meant is that he was given the authority of rulership over the earth, because the Kemites viewed Kemet as the earth, the central kingdom. And so Asar held a staff of authority. Which is the term also for Medu Netcher, a point that Dr. Carruthers makes a point of that Medu Netcher, or God's speech, is symbolized by a cane or a staff of authority used by an elder, symbolizing that the language itself embodies wisdom. But staff of authority also meant that Asar was the shepherd. Now, this notion of Pharaoh as shepherd, again, it's found all over Africa. And it doesn't mean that the people who have this notion of leadership necessarily got it from Kemet. Kemet is itself an African civilization. So it may well have drawn from a deep well in some other part of Africa. But the notion that they have this same notion among the Mosai people, Mossi, the Moro Naba, Moranaba, Sheikh Anta Diop makes reference to this, who is the king of the people of the Mosai, they are called servants and shepherds of the people. Servants and shepherds of the people. See, the theme for this presentation is here, the hieroglyphic or Medu Netcher divine mentality of Kemetic African and African American civilization. So one of the things I want to do is show the connection between Kemet, ancient Africa, and us here. You know what I mean? Because what good is the past if you're not applying it to your present? And so in my book, The Art of Leadership, Volume 1, right here, there are 2 volumes. My very definition of leadership includes the notion that for us, the best conception of leadership, the best definition of leadership is that leaders are servants and shepherds of the people, and that leading is following. And leading is following the just will and the just interests of the people, which is also the idea that is consistent with societies in which you had the people in charge and you didn't have a single leader. So what does this mean in terms of our situation today? And also, what does this mean in general? So this idea that a leader is both a servant and shepherd of the people, it does not mean that the people are a passive flock blindly following somebody. The shepherd is the servant. In other words, the shepherd is doing the will of the people. And this is the key thing. And so in both Kemet and in Black communities and African nations today, leaders or true organizers are the ones who listen to the people. They're the ones who learn from the people. They're the ones who dedicate their lives to the people. They only become shepherds when they have become good servants, or one whose service really meets the needs of the people. So a Desolane in the Haitian Revolution was both a shepherd and a servant. He was a servant. He had been a slave. He had been whipped and abused like most of the enslaved Africans in Haiti. But he rose to be the second best general in the Haitian Revolution, and many would say the best leader. I would, because his concern was that the wealth of the people be equitably distributed, that a few didn't get everything and the rest didn't get anything. But it was his service that made him a shepherd. And what made him a person who served the people? Dizzy Gillespie, in his book, To Be or Not to Bop, said that his two favorite leaders were Malcolm X and Paul Robeson. And he said the reason is they both had incorruptible characters, making them fit servants for the people, much like Asar, the pure one. So this is key in terms of the concepts of leadership, that if we're going to really do good work in rebuilding our families, communities, and nations in Africa, our nations in the Caribbean and South America, the quality of leadership is important. And at the same time, now that it be decentralized as much as possible into the hands of the people, as it was in ancient Africa, where the people had the primary say-so at the village level. Myself, my thing has been never to take money for my service. You know, that's my thing. Why? Because I'm serving out of love. I'm not serving for money. Today, we have groups like the Congressional Black Caucus. You have a few Black congressmen and women in there that are good. Very few. You know, very few. Most of them are owned by corporations, just as the rest of the congressional leadership is. And you don't see any of them going into the Black community and explaining a simple thing like neoliberalism, that, you know, the rich are grabbing everything. The reason we have homeless people is that a president that you thought was real great, Bill Clinton, had bowed to neoliberalism and ended any kind of programs for low-income housing, just as he ended welfare, and got some Black Congress people talking about, well, he was the smartest president. You might say slickest, you know. So he who pays the piper calls the tune. Where you're getting your money determines whether or not you're funny. You know what I mean? And if your money is coming from the people who oppressed you, you're not exactly going to be a mouthpiece for them. And so this notion of pharaohship, we can't go back to the age of pharaohs. This age is over. But we can draw from the best principles of leadership. Malcolm X, who was incorruptible. Not just a Paul Robeson, who was, but on most issues, King. Yeah, King played around. Yeah, he did. And that ain't right. He did that. But on essentials, he was incorruptible. You hear me? And that is what you need if you're going to be able to rebuild our families, communities, and nations. And that's what you got with a lot of these young people who are out there right now. So today in the U.S., the task of Black organizers, Black organizations, and leaders is to revitalize Black families, communities, and to transform this nation, to heal suffering that our people face at the wounds of oppression, all kinds of suffering, to take disorder and rebuild order. All of this was necessary. And so it requires that central in anything we do has to be the principle of Ma'at, harmony, truth, justice, and right order, which Pharaoh was supposed to uphold. And so today, one of the problems that you have with some of the youth, and this is a problem that's not just with some of the youth. Some of them have some ideas about values that are relative. In other words, you don't have to be too clear about your principles. It's relative to the situation. And then if you've been highly miseducated, then you've been told that there's, what is the truth? It's relative. Haven't you heard about Einstein's theory of relativity? That's got to do with time. That ain't got to do with morals. You understand? So anything we do has got to rest on this moral foundation, truth and justice, harmony, balance, a number of other things. And so again, Pharaoh was like supposed to be the embodiment of this, but in our work, we have to have that if we're going to take something that's unjust and make it just, something that's crooked and make it straight. So this idea in Kemet that the one who served the people was the one who gave the boat to the boatless, food to the hungry, and cared for the widow, and treated everyone with justice. Now, of course, in a society in which you have to give food to the hungry, it means that some have got more than enough food. You need a society that is balanced out where that doesn't happen anymore. So what we see then is that this period of building in which pharaohs, the institution of pharaohship is key, is very important. Now, key point. The key thing about building was the building of people. And so in building just society, the building of just people, that's the most important thing. And so it is the work that was done both in the period of the ancient period of Kemet and the work that was done during this period of the 3200 on period of Kemet on building people who stood for righteousness and justness that is the most important thing. And so in looking at the hieroglyphic or Medu Netcher divine mentality of the Kemites, of Africans and of African Americans, in the way in which the people have grown and in the way in which their civilizations have developed and can develop, then looking at this question of the hieroglyphic or Medu Netcher mentality is real key. This is real key. Now, in Medu Netcher, in ancient Kemet, Medu Netcher, as I pointed out before, many of you know, meant God's speech, the speech of God. Medunetcher, Medu Nefer, Meduneffer, the speech of human beings that attempted to approximate the speech of God. That's the meaning of Medu Netcher. Now, hieroglyphic in the Greek interpretation, it meant the sacred writings or inscriptions of Kemet. Now that sounds close, and that at least they're saying it's got to do with something spiritual. But the problem with that idea that hieroglyphics has got to do with sacred writing, it implies that there's a secular, a non-sacred. For the African, as some of our people have pointed out, throughout the ancient period and the traditional period of Africa, you couldn't find a single person who didn't believe in God, not a single person. That's how pervasive this idea of spirit was. So to suggest that Medu Netcher means just sacred writing is to imply that there was another side, non-sacred, and for the African, it was all sacred, every part of it. Matter was endowed with spirit, every part of it. So this is the first problem. Africans in general agree that speech itself, whether particularly oral, but then committed to writing, is a gift from God. Now, cultures develop their own symbols for writing, but the idea of communication through speech, it's a gift from God. So speech in this context is viewed the same way throughout Africa. So the Bambaras' idea of speech, and they're an oral people that don't write. They have the same idea that the Kemites have, whereas there is the speech of God and the speech of human beings. And so among the Bambara, there is the speech that comes from God, and there is, again, the speech of the human being that is sacred. And so they see this same idea, you know. Now, for the African American who is dragged into an alien context against our will through enslavement, in what becomes in America the new African context, where we draw on Central African principles, add some that come out of this experience, race first being one of them, Pan-Africanism being another, and we create this new African culture. In this culture, the pinnacle of the culture is spirit. Spirit, as it is the pinnacle of all African cultures, not religion, spirit. And what's the most common thing you're going to hear Black people talking about? The Spirit told me, baby, the Spirit said. Huh? The Spirit said this, but I should have listened. You know what I mean? Spirit. This is the key thing. And so when we're looking at the African American conception of speech, we're going to see that this centrality of spirit is key to our conception of speech and how it works. And the reason that spirit is so central to us is because we're spirits in a body. I mean, that's a human condition, but we have a culture that respects that. And because the African in America, we already know the African in the Caribbean, we know the African in New Orleans or Louisiana has this, but generally this view is a part of the voodoo inheritance of the African in America. That's basically what the Black church became. It became an institution where we dropped all this voodoo that we practiced for 246 or more years in enslavement into what we called the Black church. And that's what distinguishes the Black church from the white church, contrary to popular opinion, especially the Holiness Church. And one of the best documentations on this one is provided by our great scholar, Professor Yosef Ben Yochanan. It's entitled The African Origins of the Major Western Religions, in which his most valuable insights are on African American spirit practices, which he calls voodoo, right? So what was the basis for Medu, Netcher, or hieroglyphic thought in Kemetic and African culture? And then I'll get into African American culture. And how was it expressed? Now, this was expressed through drama. All of the writings in Kemet are dramatic writings, all of them. Now, this is something that, again, when we do this reckoning now, we often ignore, you know. So this is true as well in the oral cultures of the Bambara, for example. And it would be true of the majority of Kemites who didn't write, you know. It would be the drama in the language, the drama in the culture. And so when we're talking about the various writings of Kemet, they are dramatic expressions. This drama resembles the drama that we see in the Black church, through the Black preacher, through the way in which, through call and response, the congregation responds, through the choir and the role of the choir in the Black church, and the way in which prayer is evoked in the Black church. All of it is designed to bring down the spirit. As one great gospel singer said, old time singer, she said, I'm a gospel singer. That means gospel, Gospell. Through incantations, our singing and our rhythm is designed to put you in a hypnotic trance state. And any speaker does the same thing. I remember the one speech that I've had that I've never had again. It was at Wose Community Church, which is a Church of the African Way, and it's in Oakland. And my book on Malcolm had just come out, and I flew in from a speaking engagement in Nevada, speaking to some Black teachers. So on the plane, I was just shaping my speech up. And so when I got up to give this speech, I went into a repetition thing, which had also been a part of an article that I had given to Ivan Van Sertima for the Journal of African Civilization on great Black leaders, and mine was on Malcolm X. Ivan Van Sertima took out that repetition. He said it was too repetitive. I said, it's the culture. But in the speech, that's what I did. And what happened is, it's one of the few times where I was in a zone where I and the audience were one. That's a heck of an experience, a hypnotic state. In jazz, they call that going into the zone. I was in London years ago, and a sister whose son from the US, son was a jazz musician. She said she was watching him play in London once. He went into a zone and started playing stuff he had never played before and could never play again, because the spirits accessed him, you know? And this is high drama. And when you looked at Coltrane and how Coltrane played his music, Coltrane would listen to his grandfather, who was a preacher, and then come back home and take those incantations and put it into the rhythms of his playing. And he said, so I could move an audience. But it was the particular force that he was drawn from. You hear me? This is hieroglyphic Medu Netcher thinking. You hear me? Or Coltrane, when he has a dream and he, after overcoming drugs and alcohol, 2 weeks later, married to his first wife, Naima, sits up in his bed and he looks so peaceful. Naima said, what happened? He said, I just heard a heavenly droning sound. That became a love supreme. A love supreme. Because he was piping in to the higher forces. And you note in a love supreme, it's incantations. A love supreme, a love supreme, a love supreme. It puts a lot of people into a praying state, a reverent state, which was a part of him. They called him sweetness, because even when he was a drug addict, he never stole from anybody, never lied. You hear me? He had a great character, was a great human being. So, but you know, the Black church, particularly the Holiness Church, is the best place to see this. But this hieroglyphic Medu Netcher expression is a part of the life of Black people. You hear me? It's a part of the life of Black people. Now, Medu Netcher and Medu Nefer is a dramatic language. It's a language centered on action, and its writing is nothing but a conveyor of action. So what do you have? An eye for seeing, an ear for hearing, a nose for smelling, a foot for walking, a mouth for talking. It's, as Dr. Carruthers called it, the walking, talking, doing language, the way a holiness preacher does walking, talking, singing, prancing, dancing language. It's a language of motion. It's a language of action. So it's true in the Dogon. The book that I was introduced to Dogon philosophy through conversations with Ogo Temeli. It's in writing. He didn't write it because the Dogons don't write. This was a transcription of his speech, you know. But normally, when a Hogan, and he was not a Hogan, he was of the Boloso level in the Dogon system of the synthesis level, Boloso, comparable to improvisation in the African American system. In the Dogon system, when they're taking an initiate through initiation, that would be Adunoso, Adunoso, table of signs, symbols drawn in sand, which are signs of the universe. You know, again, in motion, these signs are action figures. But in reading it, the way in which you get it when you read it is they're symbols in motion. And the symbols hide astronomical truths, because in Jiriso, Beniso, and Boloso in the Dogon system, it's technically not teaching you astronomy. It's Sodaya, which is the highest level, the clear word, which is astrophysics. But the lower system is also introducing you to the fundamental principles of physics, and so astrophysics. So you're getting, in the way in which the word is spoken, which is dramatic. You have these moving, walking, talking, doing figures. They're moving in concentric patterns, not circular. That's the rotational planet of the stars, of most of the planets. Some planets rotate circularly, but most, it's elliptical. And so what you're seeing when you get this is that you're seeing that there's some truths here. These are fundamental truths that are being conveyed symbolically. And so it causes you to try and act like that. You hear me? To try and be like that. And so it's a process of realigning yourself with those symbols. It took me 30 years to realign, and I'm still working on it, myself with certain cosmic symbols, you know? And so this is also why Medu Netcher is action, because life is action. So it's written speech, or in the case of Mbar, oral speech, or in the case of the Dogon, speech drawn in the sand that is alive like a human being is. It is bringing those thoughts to life, and so that you can align with it. So that you won't just talk it, you'll walk it. You hear me? It's aligning you with the cosmos. This is the point. And these symbols are multidimensional. It doesn't have one meaning. It has multiple meanings because there are many sides to the truth. And they're best studied in a group where people are sharing their insights, you know? The way it is when you're listening to a good musician, you know? He wants to have an audience, but it's more beneficial to more people that can share that. And then when they compare things, they're going to learn, because no two are going to see it exactly the same way. And so this is key. So the language of Medu Netcher is a walking, talking, doing language because it imitates speech. And this is the key thing. See, we put in this inferiority complex of, oh, you're at a disadvantage, you don't have writing, you know what I mean? Our best writers imitate speech. They write the way we speak. Those are the best writers. Why? Because they're coming out of the orality of the tradition. The oral tradition in Kemet took precedence over the written one. And that's why writing was a walking, talking, doing language. So that speech is the most important thing. Why? Because, as the Bambaras say, they say, knowledge, which is what speech conveys, quote, is a light that is within man and woman. A light that is within man or woman. That light, in the New African expression, and this was Fannie Lou Hamer's favorite song, but we would sing it in the movement. Because again, you want to talk about drama, movements for social change are some of the most dramatic expressions you can have. High drama, baby. You hear me? And what's at stake is something bigger than you. Cause that is about truth and justice. And so what would we say? This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. And then if we're in jail, we'd say, all over the jailhouse, I'm going to let it shine. What is this little light of mine? That's the light of God within each one of us. That is the basis for Medu Netcher. That is the basis for the so-called picture writing. That's the basis for it. Because in the end, what you're feeling and what you're drawing from is a vibratory force that the Bambara described as God, infinite force outside of space and outside of time. M. Jewell says, okay, but even if rap artists understood their words, wouldn't be as they are. Well, I've heard rap artists tell me they rap off their dreams, some higher level ones. You hear me? So, and by the way, Medu Netcher, which is picture language, is dream language, because what you see in the dream are pictures, and these pictures are coming from God, particularly those that are accurate, those that can foretell something or that reveal something that has already happened, not understood before. I call that piping into God's mind at certain points. So the reason that Medu Netcher, hieroglyphics, and black speech, we can get into in a minute, is dramatic is it's an expression of the vibratory force that is outside of space and outside of time. That's God. See, that's in quantum physics, or excuse me, astrophysics, that's the state of singularity before existence came into existence, before, as the Kemites would say, happening happened. That is the state of nothingness. The African astrophysicist has no problem with reconciling the idea of God is infinite force outside of space and outside of time, which is singularity, the period before time, with time, because they understand one is the extension of the other. But the European astrophysicists can't grasp this first one, other than to say it's a wrinkle in space, singularity. It's a time where only a wrinkle existed, you know? Well, the African knows its source, which is beyond space and beyond time. It is a light, that little light inside of us, but that big light that is God. So when Mahalia Jackson would sing Precious Lord, Thomas Dorsey's most important song, and one of the two greatest ones in gospel blues, she'd sing, Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on to the precious land. Or when Coltrane played his music through his instrument, his saxophone. Or when the preacher in the sanctified church, or anyone, of these churches gets up and starts shouting and hollering, Lord. Or when you see the average Black church person who doesn't know the root of this praying God through praise, because praise is the form of worship to reach the infinite force, that vibratory force, that force outside of space and time, but that force that's inside of each one of us. So they know singing, dancing, shouting, drumming, all of this, and making praise statements about God. And God has no ego. God doesn't need the praise, but God is most worthy. And so when that is raised up, that's where the power comes in. But again, that's the hieroglyphic expression. That's high drama. But you see, Black people are just that way, as it is. So this same drama you find on the dance floor. Because what is Black dance? Black dance is nothing but the feelings of vibrations inside yourself that you move to and you groove to. And your hips go one way, your head goes another. And everybody's got their own way of expressing it. And these are usually complex polyrhythms. And for a musician to really play, they got to play off of these feelings. Dance is really at the foundation of all of this. And by the way, the Twa are the ones that introduced the ring shout, the counterclockwise dance. Dance to the spirituals, you know. And they said this music harmonizes the cosmos because God, as I pointed out before, the great Lakota holy man said, God's a sucker for music. Why wouldn't God be a sucker for music? Because music is the realm of vibratory force. And everything God creates got some music to it. You hear me? The planets have music to it. So this dramatic expression is found in the linguistic patterns of the African in America. The African American who is the foremost authority on this, on African American linguistics, Dow Turner, Lorenzo Dow Turner, who was the first Black in this country to get a degree in linguistics. But the key point is he used it to look at the Gullah Geechee language, but then to look at African American speech patterns in general. He didn't go off and go to France or somewhere. He sank himself deeply into our culture. And so one of the people that come up under him is a brother named Selassie Williams, who's a linguist. And he makes this point about the African American speech pattern or linguistics, because what we speak is a language. He says, quote, what makes the African American language different from English is that it closely resembles or is identical to features found in African languages. In other words, what we like to call mumbo jumbo, or people would like to call broken English, is actually following African speech patterns and African linguistic rules. So, and this is true, of course, throughout the diaspora. But the African in America who's been sold this bill of goods, you lost your culture through slavery and everything else, your best proof is your language. This same linguist makes this point. He says, African linguistics persist among Blacks in the U.S. and the diaspora because language is, quote, that set of internalized subconscious rules and habits that cannot be easily eradicated. Meaning, if you've been around for 200,000 years and speaking all this African linguistic stuff, and by the way, all African linguistics goes back to the San people in the Click language. And then everything comes out of that. And by the way, The language that Black people speak in this country that Black linguists call Ebonics is a Niger-Congo Bantu region language that conforms to the linguistic rules of that region. And it includes many African language groups, all of which share this common thing, and all of which are hieroglyphic. 80% of Blacks in the United States speak this language. And every effort by teachers, be they Black or white, to rid it out has failed. So this is really the basis for this. Now, I want to conclude this discussion with some observations made by the great Zora Neale Hurston, who was a lady I love. And when it comes to African American culture, she's the master's master, you know. Her best book is Mules and Men. I've read all her books. At least I think I have, because stuff is constantly coming out of unpublished stuff, because she was broke half the time and she had these white sponsors and she had to hide her work. And so they would want her to do something, she'd do that. And then she was doing her own writings and stuff. So stuff keeps coming out. You have this book that's come out recently on the last slave, the last African to have been sold in this country through the slave trade. It's a great book. But Mules and Men is her greatest work. I thought so, but it's the author that knows, and she said it was. And it was her work on African American culture, and specifically around voodoo. And when she went into something, she didn't do like anthropologists, and she was trained as an anthropologist, you know. She didn't do like that. She was born in an all-Black town. She lived that. And so when she studied voodoo, she was initiated. And in the initiation rite, part of which, after you've gone through a lot of ceremony, you get naked and lay in a coffin. And it's a part of the life, death, rebirth process. But she had so much deep stuff in there. So I knew it was, but I thought I knew, but she said it was. Mules and Men. You should read that. But then she's got a little piece that's just a jewel and a half. And it's called The Sanctified Church. Sanctified Church. I mean, there's some heavy stuff in here. And she got all kinds of observations on the culture. So let me just see a few things that she said about African American culture. And let's see if it conforms to this Medu Netcher hieroglyphic stuff. This is what Zora Neale Hurston says. She says that when it comes to African American culture and the African American, the thing, and I quote her now, that permeates his, and he's referring to her as well, entire self is that thing called drama. In other words, the African American is dramatic by nature. Now, those of you who like to go the negative trip, that means, oh, screaming, hollering, and shouting, and a bad relationship. I don't want drama in my relationship. That's not what she's referring to. She's referring to how in Black thought, in Black life, the smallest event is turned into drama. Somebody can be giving you directions, and when it comes to all the ways in which they gesture and raise their voice and then give you the directions, and what are they? They're hieroglyphic Medu Netcher picture directions. They don't say go north or south. They say go down 2 blocks, turn at that liquor store down there, and go down to the railroad tracks and turn right. That's called picture language. I like that kind of directions. Don't be telling me north and south. You know what I mean? Give me something concrete, you know? So she goes on and she says that in talking about or speaking to how we speak, he says, quote, referring to the African American, his words are action words. His interpretation of the English language is in terms of pictures. Huh? Oh, I think that's Medu, Netcher, or Hieroglyphic. You get this one here? So what makes Black life so interesting is its dramatic quality. It's not dead, baby. You go into certain communities and you could drop a rock and it sounds like a bomb. In Black communities, there's life. You hear me? It's the drama of being African. It's the gestures that come out of that. And I want to say that in the linguistic patterns of Kemet, of Africa and Afro-America and Africans in the diaspora in general, the verb is very important. The verb. Why? Because it conveys action. And then we have what's called the verbal noun, you know? So I'm going to the funeral. Well, we say, I'm going to funeralize him. It's active. Or we might buy the old vacuum cleaner was the Hoover vacuum cleaner. And so people will say they're going to vacuum. They don't say I'm going to vacuum. I'm going to Hooverize it. Huh? Yeah, action. And if you want to get philosophical about it, when the Kemetites talk about ma'at, they reduce it to one sentence. What is it? Speak truth, do truth. Action, baby. Action. The verb first in this particular case. Do you get it? On the plantation, you know, people called themselves, or they called others, Himbees, Himbe, meaning him be a Muslim, him be a freedom fighter. Whatever it is, they're not just talking it, they're walking it. So if we're looking at how do you educate Black children, especially young Black males who are active, you got to put them in motion. They got to be involved in action. And in that action, they learn. How do you learn truths around your own African identity? You have to be engaged in action. You just can't read a book. You got to apply this to your life. I think we're getting close to this 6-fold stages to mental freedom class. But for this to work, you got to be involved in something. If you just want some abstract thing, you can come back and talk about it. It don't mean anything. You hear me? It don't mean anything. You have got to be able to apply it. And you only apply it when you're doing something for others. That's where the transformation comes. And that was the beauty of these ancient Kemites who laid the foundation for the greatest classical civilization in the world. Someone like Asar, a pure one, and those that gave birth to him, a pure civilization in the early period, especially the hunter-gatherer period. They were about service to humanity. They were about kindness. They were about people living in harmony. They were not about cruelty and misery. And I want to say this, that what's key in my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, this book here, that provides the vision for just societies, is that it is the practice of this formula that was practiced for over 40,000 years by hunter-gatherers, and then translated into African societies, carried by us in the Middle Passage here. It was this formula for just societies that in the hunter-gatherer stage and in much of the agrarian stage of Africa meant no hunger, no abuse of women, no abuse of children, no rape, no incest, It was based on This simple formula, all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. Now, that's big, that's a whole society. To make it simple, at the village level, it was the males and females who had the power to make the decisions that made the society move. If Africa was operating on that principle right now, you wouldn't have people being able to countries to come in and buy off your resources for next to nothing, usually on IMF loans that just imprison you in economic debt and slavery. You wouldn't have that because the people would see that those resources would be used for their own benefit. You hear me? And that is the key to revitalizing our families and communities today. Where does our power lie? It lies in our people. Where does it lie in our people? It lies in our culture. It lies in those rich jewels that come, as Du Bois said, from the souls of Black folks. And in this particular case, from the hieroglyphic Medu Netcher mentality, where if you can see it, you can believe it. And if you can conceive it, you can bring it into action. I'm not into this school of positive thinking. I'm not talking about positive thinking. I'm talking about the power of us to create our reality. And I'm not saying it's easy, because the more creative you are, the more just the system you're putting forward, the more opposition you're going to get. But that's what makes you strong. The one thing you can say about Black folks is that we're smarter than the people we go up against. The proof of that is all the things we have created. And this hieroglyphic, Medu Netcher mentality, where you practice what you preach, where your talk is your walk, that's one of the most beautiful features of it. Hotep. Hope you got something out of this. Let's see what we got here. Brother Ugawa. Question, this sounds off to ask, but do Black people see nouns different than white people? And if they do, how does that impact our communication within ourselves? Well, the verbal noun is one example. You know what I mean? In other words, the active. So it's not just the subject, but it's an active subject. So the emphasis is placed on action. So that's one way. You know what I mean? Action. Okay. Wolf Manley. By the way, if you like, hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. And if you can, make a donation. Wolf Manley said, advise all in this chat to learn the Memphite philosophy theology and read the story on the Shabaka stone. Yeah, very important. You know. And Bowles, it don't mean anything if it ain't got that swing. Well put. That was from another era of the music, but it was doing the same thing. You know what I mean? Big Payback Porter. What do you think about Julius Malema? And if an African American can bridge companies here to there to support there and here while building a Kemetic town or cities like Soul Cities. I haven't read enough of Malema, so I need to read more of him. I read a little, but I need to read more. Yeah, Wolf, Manlu, Meta Netcher can be verb, noun. Yeah, it's a whole sentence structure, but it's the emphasis of the verbs and the nouns. Wolf Manlu, Nora's writings make me cry too much. Great, yet leaves me so sad. Yeah. Wonderful lady, boy. Oh, really? Somebody stole from me? Tell me who that was. Wolf Manlu, you keep hearing him speak on vibrations and frequencies. Yeah, because that's what God is. God's vibratory force. You know what I mean? That's what it is. It's in everything. Fundamental truths. Very good point, Wolf Manlu. Speaking and reading Medu Netcher or Netter has your brain operating in three areas at the same time, leaving you in an expanded consciousness. Very good point. Because what Medu Netcher is doing is trying to capture a part of God's mind. God's mind's whole. It's the everything. And so I made the point before, what African systems do is convey through anything, everything. Because that's what we are. We're miniature cosmoses in this larger cosmos. We're miniature stars, you know, and that's the way everything God created is, you know. It's the whole of a part. Okay. Wolf Manlu's making the point that our ancestors taught astrophysics through bedtime stories. Yeah, the Dogon did. Their whole society is set up as a stellar universe. Stones and everything else represent different stars, everything else. And so young people are being introduced to astrophysics when they don't even know what it is, you know. Tianja Bean, greetings to you, sister, from Bermuda. Right on. M. Jewell, Dr. Brown states, when the third eye is in a heightened state, we can see what is called the Holy Ghost state. Yeah, and it comes in many different ways. You know, it can be the third eye, it can be dreams, it can be astral flight, my experience of the light, you know, different things. Yeah. God has many different ways to communicate on this level, you know. Okay. Lao Tzu's making the point that in African culture, um, the cultural expressions don't serve a singular purpose or function. Yeah, they have multiple meaning because they're cosmic expressions, and that's what the cosmos is. You know? Lao Tzu is making the point that while Chancellor Williams said there was no standing army, a hunting party could hunt people. Yeah, but there was no standing army, and that's real key. Part of the reason is there was no need for one. These societies were basically peaceful, you know, but they had ways to protect themselves. Okay. Lao Tzu questions in terms of weapons in the pre-dynastic period. Do we ignore the concept that the first weapon is the human body, and by extension, tools can be used as such. No, but the key point is that when you examine a lot of archaeological remains from a period that goes back thousands and thousands of years and don't see hardly any weapons, and what you do are marginal weapons, that's telling you it's a peaceful period. And that's what it's telling you. And so the idea of the human body being a weapon, well, whether or not we conceived of martial arts or did wrestling, I'm sure there was wrestling and sports like that. But the point is, that's the nature of the society. You know what I mean? That's what it's showing. And you go into these archaeological remains on Europe, and you will find weapons all over the place at a certain point, you know. Isn't fear necessary to have in order to find more information on a matter, situation, or in order to be rid of it? We're living in a fear-based society, and then we have taught ourselves, and we've been taught to believe that fear has kept us from doing certain things. Fear has worked to our advantage. Yeah, there's always a positive and a negative, you know. But the fact is that fear is the greatest obstacle to human growth and development. Fear is an unnatural state. You're not born with fear, you're taught fear. Fear is unhealthy. It's physically unhealthy, it's psychologically unhealthy. It can drive your blood pressure up, it can do all kinds of things to you. You know what I mean? It's an unnatural state. But because so many people are in it, they consider the people who are fearless to be unnatural. And that's funny, you know? Good. The Hoppy conference, the Black Excellence Conference, was great. Right on. I figured it would be. Okay, let's see. Now, the statues in Kemet, throughout most of Kemet, they were part of cult activity. And cult means where the priest would cultivate the spirit in the statue. Just about everything in Africa, traditional or ancient, is spirit based. And so that's the main role that statues play, not for art's sake. It's only in the 18th dynasty with Hyksos influence that you see some of this changing a little bit. I haven't read this book, James P. Allen's Middle Egyptian. I'll check it out, though. Thanks for the reference. Hiya Heka, how can I achieve good character? This was a key thing that the Kemites had very practical measures for. And I think a lot of a civilization's concept of spirit has got to do with how they would do that. So, for example, if you're looking at the Hindu situation, meditation seems to be or is a very important practice. And I'll bet you that meditation was an Aryan invention brought into the spirit base of the so-called Hindu civilization, which is the blacks, the Dravidians, as they were originally called, in which they, being a deep spirit people, had their own practices. And it wasn't so much about meditating abstractly, but I think meditation's good. I'm not putting it down. I'm just simply saying African, traditional ancient Africans, meditation isn't the way we did it. So one way, and I pointed this out, I think, once before, one way that the Kemites did this in terms of being a better person um, was to do a daily review. At the end of every day, find a quiet place in your house and review the day. And the daily review was everything you said and did in that day and what effect did it have and your view of it. Was it positive? Was it negative? Could you have done it better? And so forth. And then the next day, trying to make self corrections. What they're doing in miniature is they are reflecting what's called the last day, when judgment comes up, where your whole life is going to be reviewed. As I pointed out before, in the higher spiritual systems, parapsychology, people who are really spiritually gifted, they've actually seen people when they pass to this other side. Some of them have actually experienced it where they have gone to the other side and come back. And when they were on the other side, the so-called stage of death, they actually experienced a life review where in milliseconds, their whole life came before them. The things they did, the things they said, and the effect that it had on other people. That is the judgment. And heaven's outside of space and time, so things that happen in milliseconds could take years to happen here, or a longer time. So that's one way, and it's one way to really get more self-mastery of yourself. No, all languages on the earth are not derived from Medu Netcher. They're all derived from the click language of the Kung. They're the first ones. Gerard, we may not have to be as sadistic as them, but we need to be more uniform and strategic. May not have to be as sadistic. You don't better not be sadistic at all. I'm a warrior. I speak from experience. You know what I mean? See, here's one of the things about war you may not know. The enemy you fight today and defeat is going to be your ally tomorrow. And if you want to stop future conflict, then you need to learn how to be magnanimous. Now, that's my nature. So I'm not going to be out. I don't insult enemies. Hannibal did it to provoke an enemy. So if that was a way to win, I would. But I haven't had to. And I treat my enemies with respect. And I've never lost a battle. And so I expect then to have my enemies to be on my side when it's finished. Whether they like me or not, this ain't about like. It's about power. Had the West pursued this policy in World War I, there wouldn't have been a World War II. You know what I mean? But because they got tough and rough on the Germans, they imposed reparations on them they couldn't pay, took land from them they shouldn't have taken, and or took. As a result, with the Depression and the rise of Adolf Hitler, you have World War II. And that's what happens. Alexandria White, thanks for this lecture. I'm processing a lot of what you said, but as we work towards dismantling oppressive systems, it is refreshing and revitalizing to learn about how to build future institutions based on Ma'at. Your lecture reinforces the urgency of claiming the wisdom of ancient Africa in order to build what we need to do today. Much love and appreciation. Yeah, Alexandria, that is the point. Our past is important. One, because it's a great thing. I mean, if you have a family and people have done some things that are positive, they're just being good people. That's important to know, and it uplifts you. You know what I mean? At the same time, history provides some answers that can be used, so you can use the past to rework it, to change the present and the future. And so if we're going to have a view and a vision of a society qualitatively different from the one that is giving us hell, then there's a lot of ways we do it. And one of them is in drawing from the depth of our past and extracting from that those things that we can use today. And certain things that are just central to who we are as a people. And you have to rest those societies on that. For example, in Africa, and this is true of the African in America, the African in the Caribbean, wherever they are, the African, I've said this many times before, is by nature, the nature of our history, democratic. The African by nature has built into them the need to have a say-so in their lives and not to have someone imposing their will on them. And so these leaders that are out there now in Africa, for example, they're not going to get things straight until they realize that their people have answers and go to them and find out what they are. And at least do a lot of your work around that. And at the local level, let them run their stuff and leave them alone because they know how to feed themselves. And let them have what they earn. Don't come in with your guns and take it. Osiah Kepo, thank you. I'm glad you appreciate it. And definitely working my butt off on this stuff, so I'm glad you appreciate it, and the others as well. Gerard, good point. A balanced heart is equal to the feather of Ma'at. Yeah, very true. And Robin, thanks for being Robin. Appreciate you and everybody else. So that's it. To all of y'all, Hotep, until next week.